Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the second of our 2021 John Lee webinar series. Today's topic is actually the first public presentation of our 2020 industry research on innovation and diversity. The topic is really, how do we finish what COVID started? If you move to the next slide, Denise. I am Chrissy McDonald. I'm the Vice President of Client Delivery at WCG Avoca, which means I oversee our consulting services, as well as our Avoca Quality Consortium and our Avoca Innovation Alliance. And I will be handing over the mic shortly to my colleague, Denise Calaprice, who is a senior consultant for WCG Avoca and one of our research experts that will be talking about the data and the research that she had done for us in 2020. If you move to the next slide, Denise. Thank you. Just to ground everyone, as I said at the start, this is the second webinar that we're hosting in tribute to the late John Lee, who was actually an early supporter and one of the first members of the Avoca Quality Consortium when it was started back in 2011. John was a believer in improving quality within clinical trial execution and was often featured in Avoca events as part of an expert panelist, and he was really passionate about sharing his industry experience and thought leadership with others. So through these events, and they'll be happening quarterly with WCG Avoca, we really hope to continue his legacy in closing the learning gaps and elevating clinical trial execution across all levels of the ecosystem. Next slide, Denise. So for those of you who don't know, so WCG Avoca is actually a life science consulting firm dedicated to improving quality and compliance in the clinical trial execution process. We do that through two different collaboratives. We have the Avoca Quality Consortium, which looks at quality and compliance in clinical trial execution, really focusing on the core components of a clinical quality management system and providing the tools and the conversations necessary to get those implemented within your organizations, as well as the Avoca Innovation Alliance that's looking at decentralized clinical trials, artificial intelligence, the change management that needs to go along, and the evaluation of our organizations and how willing and ready they are to adopt these new innovations and next generation clinical trial execution processes that really got a jump start with COVID, and we'll see some of that in the data today, as well as our consulting and research services and our online learning platform. So our overall mission and passion at WCG Avoca is really to have a positive impact on all clinical trials in the world by helping anyone who's involved in clinical research, be it sites, sponsors, CROs, or vendors, to ensure quality, ensure compliance, and improve efficiency so that medicines can reach patients faster. And we do that by coming to a common understanding of interpretations of regulations and what leading practice looks like as we're implementing those. Next slide, Denise. So how do we do that? Again, we have this powerful consortium construct with the AQC and the Avoca Innovation Alliance that allows cross-industry collaboration, which we really look at. We talk a lot about knowledge management within our organizations, and this is really industry-wide knowledge management. How do we ensure that we're not making the same mistakes that our colleagues in the industry have made at the risk of patient safety or data integrity? We should all be working together in a pre-competitive way to ensure that we're not making mistakes that would cause issue with that. In addition, we have subject matter experts that are helping to develop these materials, and much like Denise will today, use our research capabilities to find out and highlight where there are areas of dysfunction, where there is difficulty within the industry, and that leads to the practical work product that we develop and the tools and materials that we have for our AIA and AQC members to access, or our consulting clients to really help overcome those challenges. If you move to the next slide, Denise, just so you are aware, these are the logos of the Avoca Quality Consortium member companies. We have just reached 150 this past week. If you don't see your name there and you're interested in participating, feel free to contact any one of us after the conversation. if you move to the next slide, Denise. But really, this is important to us because the AQC started in 2011. The Avoca Innovation Alliance was launched at the end of 2020 and started developing work product in 2021. But all of the topics that we have addressed in this quality journey that you see here really came from our industry research. So the research that we do not only started the consortium in 2011, but it continues to drive the topics that we address each and every year in our strategy document and the materials and the tools and the templates that we develop for our members. So the conversation that we have here today isn't to just state the problem statement as we've seen and we've found through this 2020 industry research, but it's also to highlight what can we do as a collaborative to help address some of the issues that may be coming out in the data of that research. If you move to the next slide, Denise. With that being said, I am going to pass it to Denise that's going to talk a little bit about the introduction and why this was our focus and what the sample size looked like and some of the findings that she had with that research. So take it away, Denise.
Okay, thank you, Chrissy. And good morning, everybody. As Chrissy said, I'm Denise Calaprice, and I am one of the senior consultants at Avoca and one of the SMEs who has overseen some of this research. As the title to the session suggests, what we're going to do today is really to take a look at what happened in 2020 during COVID and also during the emphasis on diversity that came up during that year, and then to ask ourselves really where we go from here. So I am going to start by presenting sort of what happened with the industry survey data, and then Chrissy will come back and lead a discussion on the where do we go from here. So just to give you a little bit of background about the Avoca Industry Survey, Chrissy just mentioned that it has been at the root of a lot of what we've done over the years. The timeline she showed just goes back to 2011, but we've actually been doing the annual industry survey for, I think, nearly 20 years, exploring one topic or another in terms of the state of the industry. Usually we do it at the end of each year to ask respondents about what the state of the industry was during that year. So last year, this was conducted between September and December. And the focus of it was really, because it was a special year, last year, 2020, we wanted to ask respondents how the events of 2020 within their organizations might have accelerated operational and study design innovations within clinical development specifically, how they perceived clinical trial quality and efficiency to have been impacted. In other words, were they making these changes in kind of an emergency and compromising quality, or were they making these changes maybe because of an emergency, but experiencing gains in quality along the way? And then accordingly, whether they anticipated that their practices would snap back, or whether they had actually adapted their practices in such a way that they could move forward with these innovations, and whether they plan to do that. We also used the opportunity to ask some questions about feelings of clinical trial participation diversity, how important it was, how they felt their companies were doing, how they felt the industry was doing, how aware they were of important materials in the industry and so on. And we asked them about how they felt about their own readiness as a worker and the workforce readiness within their organizations. Okay, so I'm going to talk first a little bit about the sample. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to turn off my camera here so you can see the whole screen. I'm going to talk about the sample from 2 points of view. One is that, I want to just show you who is in the sample, because that's important to interpreting the results. But also, I want to highlight that although we can only show a portion of the data today, all of these different variables that I'm going to present in describing the sample were variables that we did analyze the data by. So we did lots and lots of subset analyses, interaction analyses, and so on. Those are all available under separate cover. But as Chrissy said, the reason we do this is to really understand, to try to understand as fully as possible what the issues are within the industry, where the issues are, who's having the issues, who has already mastered certain things, how we can best share and move the whole industry forward. But that having been said, This first slide shows the number of respondents. There were 229 respondents. And the ones that you can see here in purple are from sponsor companies. So among the sponsor companies, as you can see, most of the respondents were in top 20 in large pharma. And the ones in blue are different kinds of provider companies. And those respondents were really kind of spread across a variety of different provider company types. In terms of functional area, about half of the respondents were clinical development and operations people, about a quarter were quality assurance and control people, and the remainder were distributed across many other different functions within their organization. And in terms of trial volume, we also had a very large spread. About a third had conducted or supported as providers more than 50 trials in 2020. About a fifth, 16 to 50, and then about a quarter each of 6 to 15 and 1 to 5. And a very, very small number actually had not conducted any trials in 2020 themselves. And in terms of geographic area, we asked respondents 2 questions. We asked them where they specifically were located to get, especially in talking about things like diversity and workforce issues, whether there were any sort of local trends and feelings about those things. And we also asked them where their companies were headquartered. As you can see, the vast majority of respondents were from the US, mostly the Northeast, but we did have representation from Europe and Japan and other parts of the US as well. So now to move on to the data themselves, the first area that we asked people about was their perceptions of general innovation-related practices in their companies, so not specific to any particular kind of innovation. And this slide depicts the results to the first series of general questions we asked, just to orient you to the design of the slide, because you're going to see a bunch of slides like this. We asked them to respond to positively phrased statements about their company's practices on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being strong disagreement and 5 being strong agreement. So the 5s here are in dark green and the ones here are in dark red. So since they're all positively phrased, the green is basically positive feelings about that topic and the red is negative feelings about the topic. On the left here, we have their feelings about these topics with respect to innovations in clinical study design, and on the right with respect to clinical development operations. So those were 2 separate questions that we asked them. And then these statements are sorted in order of descending mean. So the statements with the most positive mean ratings are on the top and the most negative ratings are on the bottom. And what you can see here are a couple of different trends. The first thing I really want to highlight, and you'll be getting all of these slides later, I should mention, so I'm not going to go through lots and lots of detail on the slides. I'm just going to try to highlight the main trends I see that relate to where we go from here. The first thing that you will notice here is that for almost all of these questions, there's really a lot of spread across green to gray to red. So there really is not uniformity within the industry here at all. Accordingly, you also see that the means are generally in the low to mid 3s. So on average, the respondents are reporting kind of middling scores with respect to these things. And then the other trend that you'll see here is that the means for clinical development operations are greater than the means for clinical study design. So they feel more positively about their innovation-related practices when it comes to operational innovations than design innovations. And finally, looking at the strengths and the weaknesses, the strongest statement here by a bit of a margin is the company's ability to recognize and adopt innovations that appear likely to be successful. So just, seeing the shiny object and bringing it in-house, basically. And then the ratings get worse, slightly worse, as you talk more about implementation and incorporation activities. So effectively evaluating use, educating teams on proper selection, evaluation, and deployment, investing the right amount of resources, and willingness to try and fail an appropriate number of times in pursuit of innovation. The means get worse, and as you can see from the distributions, what's really happening there is that spread gets a lot broader. Now, as I mentioned, we broke these down by all the different background variables we looked at. So this slide depicts those broken down by company type. There's sponsor companies and provider companies, and each of the different kind of sizes basically within each of those. And to make this easier to interpret, we have highlighted in green all of the cells where the means are basically what we consider above neutral, so they're 3.4 or above, and we've highlighted in red the cells where we consider them below neutral, so 2.8 and below. So you can kind of see how the reds and greens play out across the different provider types. And what you can see here generally is that the larger companies from both sponsors and providers are the ones with the higher mean scores in each of these areas. And the smaller companies, small to mid-size in the case of sponsors, are really the ones that have the lower scores. The exception to this is the technology solution providers. They're kind of standalone there. They have very high scores. And that boils down, if we dig a little bit deeper, some of those trends can really be explained by trial volume. For all of these statements, basically, the more trials you do, the higher your ratings are with respect to all of these aspects of innovation practices. So those technology providers, although they might not be very big companies, are often servicing a large number of trials with their technology. So that was for clinical design innovations. This is the same thing for clinical development operation innovations. And it's basically the same pattern. Here, as I mentioned before, the scores are higher overall. There's more green and less red overall because there's a higher comfort level with clinical development operations innovations. But the overall pattern is the same, that the bigger companies have more positive scores, and the small to mid-sized companies more negative scores, especially in areas, anything outside of that top one of recognizing and adopting innovations that appear likely to be successful. Those scores are generally pretty positive across the board, but all of those other implementation and education and willingness to take risks and so on seem to deteriorate with company size, or once again, really, it looks like it's mostly with trial volume that the scores go down. We also asked, and this was actually a subject of a recent article in Life Science Leader, we went into some depth about the topic of the role of CROs in helping companies identify and deploy innovations. So this question here, had my organization's been introduced to new innovations through its relationships with CROs. As you can see here, the means for design and operations, 3.0, 3.3, again, lots and lots of spread. Companies with greater trial volume, generally more likely to have been introduced to innovations through relationships with CROs. And I'm not gonna go through all of this story here since it's just recently been published and it's a whole other deep story, but it does look from drilling down into the data that the more sponsors relied on CROs to introduce them to new innovations, actually the better off they were in terms of their quality results and their implementation results and so on. So that does seem like it is a successful model. And then finally, we didn't ask companies specifically about how, we didn't ask respondents specifically about how their responses to these questions would have been different a year or two ago. We actually took this data a couple years ago too, so we have comparisons, but again, not showing that today. But we did ask them overall for the industry about the extent to which they felt that the COVID-19 pandemic had served to accelerate the industry toward an improved, basically a more sustainable clinical research model in terms of its ability to endure anything that might come in the future. And as you can see here, this was not one where there was a very widespread, there was very widespread agreement that the pandemic had been critically impactful or very impactful in actually improving the research model in a sustainable way for the whole industry. So that sums up some of the questions about general innovation practices and general feelings about innovation with companies. We also went into a lot of specifics about very specific innovation adoption and impact on quality and experiences. And so I'm going to show some of that data next. This part of the survey was adaptive in that we, before we got into the deep questions, we asked respondents which of these areas they felt that they could really report well on their company's use of innovation. So we had 4 major categories here of innovations that we looked at: use of artificial intelligence in protocol and clinical development plan design and planning. As you can see, not that many people actually felt that they could report on this within their companies, both probably because of relatively low use and maybe relatively low visibility within companies where it was being used. Use of non-traditional study designs and endpoints in protocol and clinical development plan design and planning, decentralized trial activities and patient engagement technologies, and data management, risk management, and monitoring activities. And obviously that last one there, the most people felt able to report on. These 4 categories you'll see throughout the data that I'm going to show next. And you'll see here they're color-coded, and that's to make interpretation of some of the next slides easier. So you'll see those colors again. So one of the first questions we asked was just about implementation, to get a read on whether companies had been implementing these innovations. Actually, it was a list of 35 innovations in those 4 different categories. So what you see here is this is going to be a 2-slide series with the list of the 35 innovations there on the left, color-coded by categories I mentioned before. And we wanted to find out if the implementation had happened independent of COVID, if it had happened because of COVID, or if it hadn't happened at all. So this first series of 2 slides shows the fraction of respondents who stated that their companies had adopted these specific innovations independent of COVID. And the dark green represents the fraction that was already using it before COVID came along. And the light green represents a smaller fraction that just incidentally adopted it or plans to adopt it during COVID, but it didn't really have anything to do with COVID. And these are sorted from highest fraction to lowest fraction on the next slide. So you can see the ones that were most likely to be adopted independent of COVID: electronic patient diaries, risk-based monitoring, use of AI on clinical trial data to more fully understand efficacy and safety, observational trials, adaptive trials. These things here, as you can see, they span all 4 different categories, as you can see by the color spread. But a lot of what they have in common is that they really don't have anything much to do with decentralization or those immediate needs from COVID-19. On the next slide, this is the continuation of that last slide. So this is the tail end of that list of innovations, and the ones that were least likely to have been adopted independent of COVID-19. And you can see down here, there's some use of AI to detect AEs that may not have been reported, siteless trials, synthetic control arms, ship-to-home clinical supplies. A bunch of these things had not been started independent of COVID-19. The flip side of that is on this series of 2 slides. This is the fraction of companies that said still at the time of the survey, not fraction of companies, fraction of respondents who said that they could reliably report on their companies from these points of view, who said that as of the end of 2020, their companies still had no plans to use these innovations. So this is sorted from smallest fraction, meaning the smallest number of companies had no plans to use them, to the largest. And as you can see, it was very uncommon to still have no plans at all to use remote source data review, remote source data verification, telemedicine, electronic patient diaries, adaptive trials, and so on. I won't read the whole list, but there were fewer than 10% of respondents who said that their companies still weren't planning to use most of the things on this slide. Whereas on the other side, there were still quite a lot of respondents who said that their companies had no plans still to use a lot of these other things. Use of AI to detect possible AEs that may not have been reported, synthetic control arms, siteless trials, novel digital endpoints, automated workflows, and so on. These were still considered a lot more avant-garde, essentially, in that companies, a lot of respondents said that their companies still had not considered using them. And that leaves us with the fraction of respondents who said that their companies had started using these innovations because of COVID-19, but not surprisingly, the innovations that were most likely to fall into that category were ones that had to do with decentralization. So ship to home of clinical supplies, remote source data review, remote source data verification, study visits by telemedicine, and so on. And these are the ones that were least likely to be adopted because of COVID-19. The patterns were pretty, were not surprising at all, and they had to do really with the drivers for adoption and also the impediments to adoption. For use of artificial intelligence in protocol and clinical development plan design and planning, and for use of non-traditional designs and endpoints in protocol and clinical development plan design and planning, the drivers were really accelerating timelines, whereas for use of some of the other decentralized trial activities, patient engagement technologies, and so on, it was really about increasing retention, increasing compliance, reducing risk, and increasing data completeness and accuracy. So it's pretty clear why some of these would be more likely to have been adopted because of COVID-19 or independent of COVID-19. The challenges were pretty interesting for use of AI in protocol development and clinical development plan design and planning. It really overwhelmingly, the challenges that were mentioned had to do with lack of understanding of the innovation, including a real lack of understanding of when and how it might return on the investment and whether it was going to be worth the investment. For many of the other things, especially some of the things that came up during COVID, there were concerns about regulatory challenges. We may be allowed to do this now. Are we going to be allowed to do it in the future? Do we know if we're going to be able to do it at all? There were concerns about process integration, also an operational process integration. And in a smaller number of cases, there were concerns about just, again, lack of understanding of the innovation and how it might return on investment. One of the really interesting things that came out of the data was when we asked respondents to tell us those who adopted and deployed innovations just because of COVID-19, we asked them to tell us now that they had done that, would they continue to use those innovations moving forward, or were they temporary and they would go back to what they were doing previously. And what was really interesting from this is that overwhelmingly, the answer was yes. Now that we have done it, we will continue to do it. So in the dark green here represents people who said, yes, we will use this anywhere it's applicable, as much as possible, basically. And the light green are people who said, yes, we'll use this at least in some circumstances. Now that we did it. Again, I won't go through the whole list. You can look at that on slides later, but the punchline is the large amount of green here. This again is the first in a series of 2 slides. This is the second. So here are the ones where we did have some more no answers or don't know answers. And those no and don't know answers largely had to do when they were asked for their reasoning with regulatory concerns. So things like remote source data verification and that kind of thing, they just weren't really sure if the regulators would allow them to continue to do that kind of thing moving forward. But overwhelmingly, it looks like companies are prepared to continue using those adoptions, those innovations they adopted very quickly. This is related to that. We also, and it's another piece of positive news out of the impact of COVID, we asked about perceptions of the innovation's impact on clinical trial quality. And so this, we have a lot of in-depth data on this topic by different innovation and different aspect of quality. So this is just kind of a summary slide to give you the punchline. The 4 different categories of innovations are across the top here in columns: use of AI, non-traditional studies designs, decentralized trials, et cetera, the same ones we saw before. And down here along the rows are different aspects of quality, protocol compliance, diversity, retention, and so on. And again, the most positive ratings here, anything 3.7 or above is highlighted in green, so you can kind of see where they fall. But just scanning across the whole thing, what you're seeing here is that overall, it's positive. Pretty much all of these ratings are above 3, meaning that for every innovation, every category of innovation and every aspect of quality we asked them about, most people felt that the impacts on quality had actually been positive rather than compromised, basically. And interestingly, even though implementation was lowest and there was concern about lack of understanding it, some of the most positive perceptions were use of AI in protocol and clinical development, design, and planning. This is just one example of the drill down. So this is the distribution of the same thing I showed, but for AI. In protocol and clinical development, plan, design, and planning. And this is really just to show you again, kind of the spread, since I feel that the means leave a lot out of the picture. So there was not real uniformity. We have, about half of the respondents saying that their perceptions of its impacts were definitely positive, in some cases very positive on all these aspects of quality, but there's still a large fraction who were neutral, who just, they're not necessarily seeing that there's a quality benefit, but there's not a quality detriment. And there are some who feel like they're experiencing, or at least concerned about, a detriment. Now, another timely topic we took on in the survey was diversity in clinical trial participation. And for this topic, we were interested in respondents' feelings about how important it was to quality, and we were interested in hearing about how they thought their companies were doing. And we were interested to benchmark some of their knowledge in this area against their knowledge in some other areas. So this figure, it's the same kind of figure I showed before, the same way. It was, again, we asked the question, how critical to the quality of clinical research do you consider each of the following? And then we asked them about different types of diversity here. And this, again, is on a scale of 1 to 5, 5, the dark green being critically important, and 1, the dark red, being of no importance. And it's sorted in order of descending mean. So as you can see, the vast majority of respondents felt that critical to quality was representation of global and regional standards of care, gender representation as well. Racial representation came next, but there was a little bit more of a divide there. There was actually a fair number of respondents, I think at 11%, who actually felt that that really was not important. Stages along the patient journey. And then toward the bottom, interestingly, we have representation of economically diverse patients and representation of geographically diverse patients from the point of view of rural versus urban versus suburban. We find this very interesting because if you look at some sources of research, actually, like things like differences in the delivery and quality of medical care by things like race are often actually a proxy for diversity by economic condition or by zip code. If you remove economic condition, if you remove zip code, the kind of environment where they live, racial differences often disappear. So to say one is important and the others aren't important is interesting, and it tells us a little bit that people are seeing all of this as conceptually important, but not necessarily kind of deeply understanding you know, how all the gears are impact each other and how everything is interrelated in a way that they could use to really kind of solve the fundamental problem that needs to be solved. We also asked them, like I said, how they perceived that their company and the industry as a whole were performing in each of these areas. So these are the exact same types of diversity that were on the last slide. And here they rated their own companies on the left, and they rated the industry as on a whole on the right. Again, you can see the means for my company, you know, it's in the 3s, kind of neutral, and it depends on, it kind of matches what they thought about the importance. You know, gender and representation of global and regional standards of care, they actually felt that their companies did pretty well on. The things that they thought were less important, like economic diversity and so on, they were less likely to say that companies were doing well on. And a lot of them, interestingly, just didn't know, especially when you get to the bottom there about geography and economy. They really don't have any idea how their companies are doing, which says something right there. That's the dark blue. Again, you can see also the spread, you know, quite a bit of spread, especially with some of these. And another take home that was very interesting to me from this was that uniformly, respondents, the averages here that were higher for my company than for the rest of the industry. My company is doing pretty well. I think the rest of the industry is not doing so well. And the biggest spread there, I believe, was for race. Yeah, there was a 0.6 unit difference in how I felt my company is doing and how I feel everybody else is doing with respect to this, which conveys to me possibly you know, a lot of developments that may have just happened in the last year and lack of complete communication and awareness across companies about what everybody else is doing. So, you know, I know that my company took a big leap forward and we're doing a lot, but I haven't heard anything about what everybody else is doing. So I assume they're still doing what they did, you know, 5 years ago. So that's my possible interpretation of this. As a benchmark, like I mentioned, we asked respondents to rate their familiarity with a number of guidance documents. And really what we were trying to get at here was the one on the bottom, the FDA guidance for enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. So, you know, how much they actually knew about what the FDA said about how to handle this. And the awareness was not all that high. You know, it was only a minority of respondents who were in the green here, who would rate themselves as at least somewhat familiar, let alone extremely familiar. And we compared that with a bunch of other things here, even just, it was lower than even just the planned content for ICH 6R3, which hadn't come out, let alone the ones that they use every day. So clearly there's some training issues here on expectations for diversity as well. And finally, the last section that we discussed in the survey, at least that I will discuss here today, had to do with workforce considerations in clinical research innovation, how people felt about their own readiness to adopt and really effectively deploy innovations, and how they felt about how their companies were doing in terms of everybody else's readiness, workforce readiness. And here is another 1 to 5 rating question. We asked them here to rate their level of concern about each of the following on a scale from 1 being extremely concerned, and that's the dark red, to 5 being extremely comfortable. So the dark green, again, being the more positive feelings. And again, sorted in order of descending mean. And again, like you can see, middling scores across the board and very widespread across negative to neutral positive. At the top, again, was, you know, what's going on with me is what's better than what's going on with everybody else. So keeping their personal skills and perspectives up to date, given the pace of change. You know, almost half of people were comfortable with this. A lot of people were neutral, and a significant number of respondents were not comfortable with it. Things got worse as it expanded beyond just me. They were more concerned, or at least a larger fraction of respondents were concerned about the availability and effectiveness of their company's procedures for managing clinical trial quality, in the context of innovation use, keeping their company's entire workforce skills and perspectives up to date, the availability and effectiveness of their company's procedures for evaluating innovations, when do we use them, how do we use them, the effectiveness of their company's approach to assessing return on investment, and clinical trial workers' understanding of the quality implications of changes that are being made. So from a process and a workforce point of view, there was a significant fraction with comfort and a significant fraction with discomfort, and a significant fraction that was in the middle, neutral, all over the board. We broke this down in lots of ways again, and again, I'm just going to show you a couple of those breakdowns. But the punchline is kind of the same as it was before. Generally speaking, the larger companies are where we are getting the more positive scores. Still not that positive. If you look at these columns here for the top 20 biopharma and also large CROs, the means for a lot of these items are still, they're hovering right around, exactly neutral. But the companies that had a higher fraction of people with real concerns about these things beyond themselves personally were those in small to mid-size pharma and smaller companies just in general. And finally, one other little sampling of the sub-analyses. This is the level of concern by functional area of the respondent. And you can see here, again, the lower scores are highlighted in red and the ends for some of these columns are low. But the positive scores are really executive management. There is where a lot of the positive scores are falling. Clinical development operations, a little more positive, biostatistics, only 2 people, but positive. It's a lot of these other areas, regulatory affairs, medical affairs, procurement, data management, and in a lot of the others where you're seeing more concerns about workforce readiness and process readiness of companies broadly. Okay, so that's I know I went through that quickly. Like I said, the data will be available. The slides will be available after the presentation. And I'd like to open it up back to Chrissy for comment and discussion.
Absolutely, thanks, Denise. And everyone is welcome if you have any questions or comments about the data to put that in the Q&A. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, Denise, in looking at that as we started the conversation today, we through the AQC and the AIA look to pinpoint problem statements in this data to figure out where are the key issues and what can we resolve. And if you look at these sort of in 2 different buckets, the first being diversity, the second being the innovation component, one of the clear things that stuck out to me for the diversity piece was that a bulk of respondents found it to be critical to quality. However, a bulk of the respondents also didn't even recognize there was a FDA guidance sort of surrounding it. So to me, that's one of the clear problem statements that comes shining through when you're looking particularly at the diversity component. And there's some easy answers of what we can do to sort of better educate ourselves about that, forums like this through webinars to really talk about the guidance, why it's important, and why ultimately diversity is critical to quality, because I think if you can't point it back to sort of a regulation or a guidance, that makes it harder for forward progress to happen within an industry or an organization. It's oftentimes how we get the burning platform going, is pointing it back to some sort of guidance. So that was a great takeaway for me. But if you look at that innovation bucket, or even in the diversity bucket as well, if there were other really key problem statements that you saw in the data, what does that look like to you in terms of the innovation piece?
I think that in both of those areas, the way I interpret the data is that, we're talking, it's kind of a lack of maturity. We're talking about immature spaces. We're talking about things that people are positive about, I'm trying to be general enough to cover sort of both diversity and innovations. They're positive, generally, widely positive about the importance of diversity, especially in the areas where it's gotten more publicity, honestly. With COVID, a lot of publicity about differences across the world, differences by race and so on. And of course, gender, we've been talking about for quite a while. So they're picking up on that and they're positive. And the same thing with innovations. They're positive. They think they're good things. They're going to increase quality. They're seeing them increase quality and so on. But it's, and that's great. That's a start. But what we're seeing is that the progress from the positive perceptions and feelings to the actual foundations needed to execute on all those things effectively and make them happen. As an industry as a whole, we're not in a mature space. Some companies have gotten there, and like I said, when you really drill down, it looks like a lot of it's really a matter of trial volume. If I'm doing a lot of trials and I have a lot of opportunities, and there are some places where I can afford to take a few more risks, or some places where maybe it's more necessary to do it, then I have moved forward and I'm starting to figure that out, and I have very positive results. If I'm not there yet and I can't afford to take the risk, or I haven't had the opportunity or whatever, then I haven't yet gotten there with the rest of this infrastructure. So that's what I see, and I think what that tells me is that all of this can be done very well, because we're seeing significant fractions of respondents in the industry saying, we have got this, we're doing this really well, we're having really good results, we're going to keep it. The others just need to learn to do that. They need to get the learnings from those people.
Yeah, it looked to me like a practice makes perfect type of situation, and the trial volume, people being more confident, is likely due to them having more experience in doing it. And as a result, they've been able to refine the processes. Because what I noticed in the challenges to adopting those innovations across, I think there were 3 different buckets. There were 4 challenges across those 3 different buckets that were all the same. And it was that unclear value prop, lack of understanding of the technology, and then the operational and process integrations. The 4th one being regulatory challenges, right? Which we know as a collaborative, there are ways that we can address that, but to a certain extent, and then we have to work within those boundaries. But those first 3, the unclear value prop and the lack of understanding and the operational process integrations, to me are really ripe for more rapidly getting that fixed, agnostic of an organization's trial level or number of trials that they're running within their organization, because that's where that shared learnings across organizations and really even through their vendors, right? The value prop, oftentimes within organizations, maybe we're not as great at measuring that sort of proactively to find out, did it do what we wanted to do, whatever this innovation is? But the vendors are phenomenal at that, right? That's their sales pitch. But really working together to sort of, through leading change events or collaboratives, be it the AQC, the AIA, or others out there, to really, understand the technologies, develop sort of thought tools of when to utilize those technologies, when they're going to be beneficial, when you're going to realize that ROI, or when you're sort of just implementing for the sake of implementing without thinking through how the real value is going to come through. And I think all of those come from understanding the technologies. And the more we start to have conversations about them, the more we start to talk openly about the challenges that we experience, I think the easier it is to sort of solve that and gain the experience, even if it's not our own, but learning through others' experience to be more optimistic and less cautious, I think. Because ultimately, the regulatory challenges are what's listed, but it's not as if the regulators are saying you can't do it, right? The regulatory challenges impacts your risk analysis, right? And you don't want to try it because you fear that it's against the regulator's sort of design or wishes or guidance, and therefore there's going to be a regulatory inspection. So I think the regulatory challenges one is a unique one to think about, because it feels almost, I want to say the easiest, and we know that's not the case, because the regulators aren't going to sort of green stamp anything that, yes, you can do that. But that one almost feels the most important about experience, but a completed experience, right? Because people are looking to make sure that there's no pushback from the regulators on that innovation to then say, okay, we'll move forward with it, right? Is there anything to be said about that, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those concerns have a little bit more of yes, no answers. You know, can we keep on doing this, or can we not keep on doing this, right? It's not the same kind of concern as I don't understand what this AI does, or I don't know how to integrate all my technologies and processes. Those are much less of you know, just give me an answer and then I'll know. But I share your I think I share your optimism. I think it's, I actually, to be honest, these data were more positive than I expected. To see all of the implementation and adoption that happened during COVID, and to see the fractions of respondents who said, we're going to keep it, I did not expect it to be that overwhelming. And this happened kind of, you know, almost like in an emergency, without a lot of preparation, without extensive organized information sharing, granted with a lot of adrenaline and a lot of urgency and probably a lot of resources dumped into it. But it was possible to do that under those conditions and have largely positive quality impacts, not just neutral. You know, to me, it would have been, okay, it's an emergency, we got to do all these things. At least if we're neutral with respect to quality, we're coming out ahead, because it was a stopgap, but it was better than that. So, I mean, if we can do that in a year, then yeah, I think we're very ripe to be able to try to, as long as we do the right things moving forward, you know, collect the right information, collect the experiences, share the experiences, have the communications we need to with regulators and with each other, the potential from the data sure looks very positive.
I agree. And I think the one thing that, you know, I sort of hope to take forward with all of that you just said is, WCG Avoca did it through collaborative conversation, but so did others. You know, the FDA was coming up with, well, forget the FDA, global regulators were coming up with updated guidance. I mean, at one point it was on an almost daily basis where some other country put out a new guidance. And there really was a community, and it was, as a whole, everyone who is conducting clinical trials right now, how do we live till tomorrow, right? Okay, well, here's what we did, or here's what worked and here's what didn't work. You know, we had the rapid response working group through the AQC, where weekly we were talking about kind of, here's the newest update of what we tried and what didn't work, or here's what did work and we would recommend it to everybody, or here's the plan that we made to do this and send it out to everyone. And to your point, we saw that during COVID, because we were in active communication, not just within our own organization, but with other sponsors who were doing the same thing, with sites who were managing different sort of problem sets in their location, as well as with the regulators who were, you know, more rapidly responding to the problems that everybody was experiencing. So to be able to sort of keep that momentum and keeping all of this top of mind, I think would be an amazing path forward, to just sort of keep the communication open in terms of, you know, here's the challenges we're experiencing now with AI, or, you know, whatever the newest technology is that comes out of this decentralized clinical trial movement that we saw through COVID.
Yeah, it's always interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Nope, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's always interesting to me about the urgency, because, you know, there was all of this urgency because of COVID. And of course, it was spreading and it's infectious disease. But our whole world really, I mean, we're dealing with life or death always, right? We're dealing with illness always. We're dealing with cancer. We're dealing with heart disease. We're dealing with things that are very painful and very deadly. And that's what we've been doing for many years, not just last year. So how did we ever not have that sense of urgency in the first place? Is it just because we do it every day that we get kind of inured to it? And is there a way that we can take a look at last year and say, gosh, this year it's really not that different. It's not COVID, but it's still whatever it is,
Yeah. As if you look at if you take a look in the mirror, right, the reason why it was so urgent to everyone is because it impacted everyone. It wasn't, while everyone knows someone who was impacted by cancer, it wasn't that you could sort of look around your household and say everyone is being impacted by this right now, and maybe not necessarily by having the disease, but the fact that
it was a threat.
Kids weren't going to school. Yeah, you weren't going to work. People lost their jobs. It was, we have to stop this in its tracks right now, and we have to do that in a certain way. So I think it sort of brought to the forefront why we do what we do, and made us understand, I think, our patients better, and why we need to have the urgency for them to keep that trial running too, because we were feeling the impact of it all at the same time. So anyway, any final thoughts, Denise, before we wrap today?
Just to thank everybody for being here. Again, there's a lot of data. We do have a publication already out, probably more to come. The report will be available. I'm happy to answer any questions about it. We're not hard to find. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yes, thank you. And just as a reminder, everybody's going to get a copy of the report following the webinar today. So you'll get the entire industry report that you'll be able to have. And then if you are interested, as I said at the beginning, in becoming a member of the AIA or to learn more about the AQC, feel free to contact Dawn Auerbach at theavocagroup.com. So we'll talk to you all again soon. Thanks for joining us today.